Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Michelle Diamond speaking to you live from the Arizona Charter Schools Association's training conference room in Phoenix. Welcome to the IDEA CSEA, that is Charter School Expansion Act grant webinar. So we're going to be spending about an hour of your time today to go through this grant with you. And since I will be taking an hour of your time, I think it's only fair that I introduce myself a little more so that you know really who's talking to you from the other end of the line. As I said, my name is Michelle Diamond. I'm the CEO and founder of Diamond Financial Solutions. And we have been in business 9 years. We offer services in charter school finance and business management. What does that mean exactly? It means that if you need a business manager or a chief financial officer, we are here for you. Or if you just want to provide additional support to your existing finance team, we can do that as well. We also offer a slew of services in the operations and compliance area. So if you haven't checked us out yet, my information is on the screen. My website is there, so please feel free to do so. We'd love to help you out. For those veterans out there, you may remember me as the Director of Finance over at the State Charter Board. I served in that capacity between 2002 and 2007, when at that time I left to start this company. I also serve on the Association's Charter Leaders Advisory Council and their Finance Committee, and I am offering this webinar today in partnership with the association. They have been gracious enough to offer their facility and their technical assistance, so a big thank you to them. Okay, so let's get to it. Let's talk about the purpose of this training. The purpose of this training, there's really 3 reasons why this training is being provided to you. If by the end of this session I can't, or I have not shown you or proven to you why you should care about this grant, even if you aren't expanding, I want you to call me up and I want you to scold me severely, because that's just not acceptable. That's how important this grant is, again, even if you aren't expanding. You also should be able to assess on your own if you should apply for this grant. I want to make sure that I'm giving you the tools to do this, that you're not dependent on anyone else. You don't have to call up the Department of Education and ask, that you can make that assessment on your own. So again, those 2 things you should know before or by the end of this training. Number 3, I'm gonna walk you through how to complete the application, and that can be a little confusing to people, and it's a boatload of information. So if you don't know that by the end of this session, no worries. This training will be recorded and will be provided and available to you. It might take a little while, but it will be available to you. Okay, a couple housekeeping items. I have muted everybody to ensure that you can hear the presentation without background noise. But if you are joining us by phone, you will need to do that on your own. So please do that so that we don't hear you inadvertently. Also, if you have questions, I welcome them. Please type them in the chat box. I will be stopping periodically to see them and answer your questions. Okay, so let's talk about the IDEA Part B basic funding. Wait, what? I thought this training was about the Charter School Expansion Act, the CSEA grant. Actually, the 2 are very, very connected, and that's very important to understand. So let's take a minute to understand your IDEA basic grant, which I'm sure most of you out there, if not all of you out there, are very familiar with. This is the grant, the entitlement grant that we apply for every year to help us fund our expenses that we incur by providing services to special education students. But what you may not know is how your IDEA basic grant allocation is determined. It's actually based on 3 buckets. The first one is your special education student enrollment base funding based on the 1998 census. And that is the blue section over here in the pie chart. As you can see, that piece offers you $508.29 per pupil, depending on what your base is. The second part of your allocation is based on your percentage of the state's poverty. So that's over here in green. And then the third part is your percentage, your school's percentage of the state's overall population. And that is over here in the brown. So those three buckets comprise your allocation for IDEA Basic. Now, I'm going to put on my business manager hat throughout this and try to anticipate some of the questions that you might have. If I were you, I might be thinking, well, what if I opened after 1998? Then the census wouldn't have my information. And in fact, the CSEA is the mechanism by which you can address this. For those charter schools that opened after 1998 or have experienced significant increase in their special education enrollment, they are eligible to submit the data to the department through the Charter Schools Expansion Act grant. In fact, it's the only way that you're really going to update that census through this grant. Now, you'll see here in red, I talk about this grant should be submitted annually to ensure accurate funding, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So again, I want to make sure that two things are very clear. The connection between the IDEA Basic Grant, the grant that you apply for every year, the connection between that and your Charter School Expansion Act grant is that if you opened after 1998 or you experienced an increase in special education after 1998, the only way to update this bucket over here, this blue base funding bucket, and you'll notice it's the highest per pupil amount, is through the Charter School Expansion Act grant. I'm going to test you after this, so be prepared. So if you're wondering, how come I didn't know about this before? I never heard about this. Well, you wouldn't be alone, actually. The association, through their stellar research department, found out that there were a lot of LEAs that actually did not realize this. And so back when they started, when they should have applied for this grant, they did not. For whatever reason, they did not. And so they have 0 when it comes to that blue bucket that in the pie chart that you saw. They have 0 base. So you may be saying, well, I don't understand. I mean, I never used this grant before. I never used or applied for the Charter School Expansion Act grant, but I am continuing to get my IDEA Basic funding. Why is that? Well, the reason for that is because, yes, you are getting your IDEA Basic funding, but it's based on these two pots only. It's not based on, it does not include this bucket over here, which again is the highest per pupil funding. Now, for those of you who are thinking, well, okay, I'll just apply for it now and I'll make up for all of that. Unfortunately, that is not possible. You are not able to go back in time and recoup all of that funding that you could have gotten had you applied for this early on. But what we are going to show you is how to apply for it now so that you can at least correct your current year and you know how to update your numbers moving forward. So back when the association investigated and found this out, they learned that in fact 268 LEAs had 0 or were not getting paid for that blue bucket. Last year, we offered this training and we assisted with their completing the application in fiscal year 15. And I'm happy to tell you that over 140 schools at that time did submit a Charter School Expansion Act application last year. And it resulted in over $2 million being allocated to those schools that would have never received that money. So that's a great thing. Is your LEA impacted? Well, we're going to find out. Should you apply? I'm going to actually read to you what the guidance says regarding this grant, and I'm going to read it verbatim, and then I'm going to show you where to find this guidance when we get into the actual grant application. So this is a memorandum put out by the Department of Education, Connie Hill, Finance Director of Exceptional Student Services, related to this grant. And it says, the Charter School Expansion Act was enacted to ensure that newly opened and significantly expanding charter schools receive IDEA Part B funds for which they are eligible. So you'll notice that term again, significantly expanding charter schools. What exactly does that mean? Well, as it turns out, it's not a hard science. If you call the Department of Education and you ask them what that means, they're likely to tell you that they want you to focus on, that they focus or they make the determination on a case-by-case basis, but they use in large part whether or not a school is adding a site, adding grade levels, or increasing their enrollment cap. Now that makes sense, right? Because if you're doing any of these, you're anticipating more students. So it makes sense then that the expanding term would apply to you. But what if you're not doing any of those, but you just have more students? Are you able to apply for this grant? Well, as it turns out, there is a 10% rule that they also use. So generally, if they start by saying, has your special education population increased by at least 10%? And when I say special education students, I mean new SPED students to your school or newly identified students to your school. So you may have a returning student that was not SPED last year but has been identified as SPED this year. Those students would also be included. So basically, if you think about that, if you have 100 students, or let's say you have 10 special education students in your school, and you get one additional student, well, there's your 10% right there, right? So you can see where it's very, very ambiguous in terms of significantly expanding, because if the 10% rule is applied and all you need is one more SPED student to come to your school, and you've met that, then you can potentially apply for this grant. So I don't have any illusions that I've made it super clear to you whether or not you should apply yet. But I hope what I've shown you is that there is a lot of room for discretion. And so we're going to continue on here, and I'm going to give you more tools by which to assess whether or not you should really apply for this. You shouldn't rule it out, I guess, is the bigger point, right off, because there is a lot of discretion here. And so there are more things to consider when you are determining whether or not you should apply for this grant. Okay, so let's move on to the actual grant application, because I think as we move forward, you're going to learn a little bit more of those tools, and it's going to become more and more clear to you how to assess whether or not you should apply for this grant. So I am going to now get into the Department of Education's website. Bear with me here. Now, the Arizona Department of Education, the Arizona Autism Charter Schools has graciously agreed to let me use them as a guinea pig here, as a test case. Thank you so much. And so we're going to pull them up in just a minute. Okay. Okay, So for those of you who are familiar with grants, you know ADE Connect by now. This is really what replaced grant management. And so we're going to be using ADE Connect for the rest of this training session. If you are not familiar with this application, unfortunately we don't have a lot of time today to really go over it. However, I will say, first of all, check with your business manager or your grants person. They can walk you through this. And if all else fails, then there also is webinars there are webinars being provided by the Department of Education on how to navigate this. But I am going to assume for our purposes today that you know how to do this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over to funding applications. And you're not going to see the application here. It's not an entitlement grant. You're going to see it under competitive funding applications. And so we're going to see IDEA Charter School Expansion Act. Now normally it'd say not started, so you're just going to click on this. Okay, so you probably, again, for those of you who are familiar with AD Connect, this page I'm sure looks very familiar. It's the sections page. For the purposes of this grant, I want you to go straight down to the program details page. That's the meat and potatoes of this grant. Now, for our purposes today, I'm actually going to just get rid of this stuff because I want to do it with you. This too. Okay. So what I want you to do is look here at this very top section where it says allocation calculation. This is actually where you're going to learn or calculate what it is that your allocation would be for this grant. I want to draw your attention to the free and reduced lunch eligible, current free and reduced lunch count. Okay, that's the first line or the first row here. This is very, very misleading, I think, because if I didn't know any better, I would think that this is asking me for my current free and reduced lunch count. But in fact, all of these fields, the three that are here that you would enter data, it's actually asking you for the difference between this year and last year. So you're going to need to have those counts available to you, this year's and last year's, in order to calculate that difference and put it in these fields. Now, there is a allocation worksheet produced by the Department of Education that we have available that has all of last year's data on it. And I'm going to bring it down here for you. We're going to have to share screens. That's what this is. This allocation worksheet is produced by Connie Hill at the Department of Education, and we have it available. We will make it available to you. It usually is available on AD's website, but this year the Excel version is not available, at least last I looked. So I've got here in red Arizona Autism Charter Schools, and you're going to see here, you're going to see various columns, which I wish I could highlight for you to make it easier because you're looking at a bunch of data here, but you're looking at column G where it says October school year 14-15 poverty count, and then you're also going to look at column J, which is October school year 14-15 enrollment, and then you're going to look at column F, column F for your base sped counts. Now this is going to make sense to you in just a minute. So I'm going to go back to the grant application for the time being. So current free and reduced lunch count for Arizona Autism Charter School is 108. Last year, if we were to pull up this allocation worksheet, you're going to see that the poverty count was 78 right here. So the difference, it was 78. I'm so sorry. Let's see, get here. Yes, it was 78. So the difference here is 26. The difference between this year and last year's poverty count is 26. So we're going to put that in there on the top line. Now we're going to go to current enrollment. again, the difference between the two. So this year's current enrollment is 108. If we look at the allocation worksheet, the total enrollment in column J is 87. And so the difference between that is 21. So we're going to put that in here. Now, if you didn't have the allocation worksheet, you actually have access to this information already because your data in SACE, that is your data in your student management system, SMS, is uploaded into SACE. And so you should have that data available to you. This is actually where ADE gets this information. It's pulling it from your SACE data that you've uploaded. Now, the problem is you and I both know that with your student management system, you archive that data, so it's not that easy to access prior year stuff. You can do it if you have to, but it's not that easy. So it's really good to have this allocation worksheet available, on which we're going to make it available to you. Okay, lastly, you're going to have the base allocation of your SPED students. So your SPED students this year and your SPED students last year. So this year, the current SPED count is 108. Whoops, pardon me. And last year's base SPED students, if we look over here in column F, was 86, and that's a difference of 22. So we're going to put that here. So you can see here that when we submit this grant, this is what their allocation would be, $13,813.19. Now I'm going to stop and I'm going to think about what questions you might have. So one question I would have is, well, Michelle, you're talking about entering counts. I'm a business manager, or I'm somebody who knows about the 40th and the 100th day, and so when I hear put counts in, I'm wondering, are you talking about ADM? Are you talking about enrollment? Are you talking about as of the 40th day or the 100th day? So let me see if I can answer those questions for you. So we're talking not about ADM in this case. We're talking about actual student counts or heads. That's one thing. Don't worry about ADM in this case. And we're not talking about the 40th or the 100th day either. We're talking about the most current data that you have, okay? So as of today, presumably, if you're going to be completing this application. Okay. All right, so now that we know what our allocation is, we can move down to the rest of the page. Now this is what I'm going to show you now is a little different than the entitlement grants that we typically do because it requires a lot more individual student data than the entitlement grants. I'm looking now at your data summary in the top left hand. Underneath where we did the allocation calculation, it says data summary, and underneath that it says student SACE number. It's asking for the student SACE number. Well, of who? What is it asking for exactly? So basically for this number here, for our base allocation SPED students, we put in 22. That was the difference between this year's SPED count, more students, versus last year. For every one of those 22 students, we have to put in a data row that provides the Department of Education with the student SACE number, their date of birth, whether or not they have a current IEP, and their entry date into the school. So you'll see that you start with one row, but if you have 22 students that you're claiming, you're going to need 22 rows. So you're going to hit underneath there, underneath that box, add a row. And then you're going to add another row. And you're going to have, again, 22 of these rows, or whatever number you put in your base allocation SPED students, that's how many rows you're going to have. Well, where you get all of this information, where do you get the student SACE ID number and the date of birth, etc., the entry date? You're going to go to your SACE coordinator, and you're going to ask them to run a report, because you would have had to have some information already to know that you have 22 students to put in there, right? Because you took your current count minus last year's count. So those 22 kids have to be somewhere. And so you're going to go to that same source of where you got that information, only you're going to get more detailed information now. Okay. Now we're going to follow down the rest of the page. A lot of the remaining portions of this page are going to look very, very familiar to you. Narrative program questions, describe the project in detail. Well, this is very similar to your IDEA basic grant entitlement grant application. You don't have to be creative here. You can just copy and paste whatever you put in your IDEA basic. Now, I just another question to answer. This grant that we're talking about right now is fiscal year 16 grant. It is due on June 10th of this year, and it is applicable to this year's expenses, okay? Yes, we're discussing this late in the year, but it is for fiscal year 16. However, the numbers that you're going to put in this grant are going to impact your IDA basic application allocation for next year. Okay, so you're going to describe the product in detail. Again, whatever you put in your IDA basic application this year, copy, paste it, put it in there. Charter opening or expansion date. Put in this date whatever is applicable to you. So if you're a new school, you're going to put the date that you opened. If you're expanding, like let's say you're adding a grade or adding a site, you're going to put the date that that happened. And if you're just increasing the number of students that you have, then just put in the beginning of the school year. Overview of population to be served, number 3. Same thing, copy and paste that from your IDA basic application. And then it says for existing, this is number 4 now, for existing expanding charters, please complete the following. The results of this formula should be the count you enter into the allocation calculation table above. Let's scroll down a little bit more. What this is referring to are these rows right here. It's asking for your total current population, your previous school year enrollment count, your population increase, so the difference between the two. Does that sound familiar? Well, it should, because we did exactly that in order to be able to enter the information into the allocation calculation, the calculation allocation. So basically, if you want to start this page by going straight down to number 4 and completing these squares, you can do that, because you're going to use that information to directly put that data into the top. It's entirely up to you. So we're going to do the same thing that we did up top here, only up top we used the difference between the two. Down here we're actually giving ADE current year, previous year, and then the increase, okay? So the difference here would be what we put in the top. So the total current population for Arizona Autism, and again, that's just your current population, was 108. Previous school year based on the allocation worksheet was 87. What is that? Well, that's 21 student increase total. Okay, total poverty. That's for current school year right here. Free reduced lunch eligible for current school year. Well, that number for Arizona Autism is 104. But last year it was 78. And what's the difference? 26. So we have 21 and 26 that should be up here. Well, they're upside down. So total current enrollment is 21. You'll see that right here. And then free and reduced lunch eligible is 26. You'll see that right here. Okay. So lastly, of course, the base allocation, it's not asking for down in number 4, but it is critical that you put that in here to calculate your allocation. So that's where that 22 came from. Number 5, what is the school year 15-16 Fund 1000 Program 200 subtotal of your annual budget? Again, same question is in your IDEA Basic Entitlement Grant, so you should be able to find it in there. If you can't, you can always go to your business manager. They would have had to know this in order to complete your budget. And all of the questions below that, the special education policies and procedures 1 through 3, you would see this in your IDEA Basic. I'm thinking that you really need to say yes here for every one of them. You should have policies and procedures, and if you don't, you need to get yourself into a position where you do so that you can say yes to these questions. And then your eligibility assurances, you'll see that in your IDEA Basic Grant, yes to all of these as well. And then you're done with this page. Make sure you say save and go, and you can go back to your sections page. So that is the meat and potatoes of this grant. But we're not done yet. We actually still have a couple things we need to do. If you remember, I read to you the guidance for this grant. So now I want to show you where you get that. We started with program details. Now we're going to go down here to related documents on the sections page. And we're going to scroll down to where it says IDEA Charter School Expansion Act Application Memorandum, Read Only, Upload Not Required. So you're just going to open that document up. Okay. So this is that memorandum that I read to you. I just read to you this very first paragraph here about who's eligible for this. And pretty much most of this paper application, which is what you really have just opened up, you can find on the ADE's worksheet. Okay, on that application, it mirrors. It's only providing you the electronic version. This is the paper version. But what I do want to alert your attention to is something that is not in the electronic version, but it's something that you still have to do for this grant. Just a side note here, you'll see if you scroll down enough, there's a 2016 Charter School Expansion Act allocation calculation. It is the same thing as the first table that we ran into on the program details page. It helps you calculate your allocation. You don't need to fill this out because you're doing that when you're in an ADE Connect application. But it just might look familiar to you. Okay, I want you to look at attachment 4. It's called a Dear Administrator Letter. And it's very important that you do this. If you remember, Arizona Autism had 22 new special education students. So because they had 22 new students that they're claiming, they have to send out 22 Dear Administrator letters. And I'm going to read to you what this says because it'll make more sense if I do. Dear Administrator, our school needs your help in complying with the requirements of the IDEA Charter School Expansion Act. The Act requires specific information and requires that you complete the information on the students below. You have 21 days to return this data to us. ADE has advised us that failure to meet this requirement may result in your current IDEA funds being interrupted pending compliance. And you'll see here that the form is asking for the name, the date of birth, the SACE number. Does this sound familiar? The current IEP, and the exit date. Okay, so back here in the grant application, let me just see if I can find it. I'm going to go back up to sections here. And then I'm going to go back to the programs page. Remember how we did the data summary? And it was asking you had to enter in 22 rows underneath the allocation calculation section. You had to add 22 rows because Arizona Autism is claiming 22 new students. And it asked for the student SACE number, the date of birth, current IEP, and entry date. Okay, well, this particular Dear Administrator letter is asking for the same information, except it wants the school that you're sending this to complete the exit date. So you're going to complete this letter and you're going to have the name, the date of birth, the SACE number, and the current IEP, yes or no, completed already. The only thing that the school that you're sending this to, which is the last school attended by the student, is the exit date. They have to enter that. Basically, the state wants to confirm where the student was prior to you and what the exit date was, and they can verify this, of course, in SACE. So again, you're going to have all of these sections filled out except the exit date, and there, the school you're sending this to is going to complete the exit date. Then the school you're sending it to has to fill out who's signing it, so print their name, sign it, and indicate their title. And then they're going to send it back to you within 21 days, and you are the receiving charter. You're going to indicate who should be receiving this, presumably your SPED director, and your SPED director is going to sign it when it comes back. Okay, now again, I'm going to think about all the questions that might be coming to your mind right now. One of them is, well, what if they don't respond? What if they just, I sent it out to all the schools, but the schools don't all send it back? You're right. You don't have a lot of enforcement power here. The beginning of this letter is meant to kind of scare the other school into complying. Most schools have seen this come through at one point or another, and I personally have not had much trouble getting responses. It might take me an additional effort of once or twice more, maybe call up the school if I don't get it. But the bottom line is, so long as you have proof you sent it out and you have proof, you just document your efforts in getting it, that's really all you can do. Another question that I get frequently is, well, what happens if this is a newly identified student, so they're actually coming from my school? Do I send myself a letter? And that sounds really silly, but I guess what I would say is I would recommend yes. And the reason for that is because you need to keep this on file, and you might actually have some turnover, right, in your SPED director position. And so if you don't send this to yourself, and let's suppose you get monitored and then you decide to create one at that point in time, then you're basically asking, you're asking your current SPED director to fill out and sign for a student that they may not know or have on their roster because they were at your school a couple years ago, but because you didn't send or create this letter for yourself at that time, now they have to sign. And so that's an uncomfortable position. And so I would just treat yourself like you would a separate school and just create a Dear Administrator letter for all of those students in that circumstance. Another question I get frequently is, do I send all of these letters that I get back to the Department of Education? And I'm going to alert your attention to the very bottom note at the bottom of this page of the attachment 4. It says, note, receiving charter schools must keep this form on file for monitoring purposes. That's all you need to do. They actually do not want this form sent to them. If you can imagine, that would be thousands and thousands of pages of this for every school that actually applies. So no, you don't need to send it to them. That's part of the reason why it's not part of the electronic application, but you do need to be aware of it, do it, and then keep it on file for monitoring purposes. Okay, we are going to get out of this now and go back. I'm going to take you back to the sections page. There's just a couple of other things that I want to make you aware of. Bear with me. I don't know why this is not actually going back to the sections page. I seem to have lost maybe my connection. Try it one more time. Ah, there we go. Okay, I want to draw your attention to back into related documents where I showed you where to get the guidance and where to find the Dear Administrator letter. And again, for those of you who are wondering where you get the data for the previous school that the student attended and the address information, typically you would have that in your student management system. I know I keep that information. So that's where you would get it. You'd have to ask your SACE coordinator for that. Okay, I want to alert your attention to a couple things. There are a couple of required documents here also. The IDEA FFATA, this is the same form that is required when you apply for IDEA Basic. So I'm sure it's going to look familiar to you, but it is required to be uploaded. So make sure you do, otherwise you'll get a validation error. So that's what that looks like. And then there's IDEA contact information, and that also has to be uploaded. And it's taken forever to come up here, but see if I can try it again. Okay, not working. Really, it's just a here we go. There we go. Very short section on contact information. This is also required in IDEA Basic. In this case, it's just an additional form that has to be uploaded rather than entering it into the electronic application. Okay, so we're going to go back to the sections page now. We're going to go to where it says budget. So now we're getting into territory that I'm sure you're all very familiar with if you've done any grants at all. Now that you know what your allocation is, you have to actually submit a budget that shows ADE how you're going to be spending that money. And I won't spend a lot of time on this because, again, I'm hopeful that you already know how to do this. But I will give you just a few tips that Connie Hill wanted to make sure that I passed on. And that is, if you do plan on spending this money for teacher salaries, then you want to be sure to indicate that your teachers are highly qualified, okay? And if you're planning on spending the money for para-professional salaries, be sure to indicate that they work under the direct supervision of the highly qualified special education teachers. Again, this is not any different than your IDEA Basic grant application. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to go through my list here. So now I want to kind of take you back to where we were when we talked about how or if you should apply and what criteria you should use to determine that. So remember the IDEA Basic allocation or the IDEA Basic grant and how that impacts and how that is correlated to the Charter School Expansion Act grant, right? We talked about that base funding. So what I want to do is I want to show you, I want to bring up this. Here's that allocation worksheet that we talked about. And I want to draw your attention to column F. And I want to show you or draw your attention to the fact that if you look all the way down, you're going to see many schools that have zeros. Now, Arizona Autism has nothing in column E. That's the original 1998 census. But they do, as we know, have an amount in the column F, the 1998 CSEA census column. They had 86 sped students because, again, they submitted a grant application in fiscal year 15. But there are a number of schools who don't have any. They have zeros or nothing in columns E and F. So what that is telling you is that all of those schools that have zeros are getting zero for this bucket here. They're only getting funding for this and this. So that's really important because if you realize that the only way to change that is to actually begin submitting a grant application for the Charter School Expansion Act. Then you start to see the importance of the correlation between the two. And even if in this current year you're not expanding, you're going to want to consider every year whether or not you should submit this application. So in the end, there's really going to be three scenarios here. The first scenario is for those of you out there who actually very obviously meet the criteria of significantly expanding. So that is that you're either adding a site, you're adding grade levels, or you're increasing your enrollment cap because you clearly are expanding. And Arizona Autism is a perfect example of that. They started their school last year, and this year they continue to grow, and they are adding a site next year. The second category is going to be those of you who maybe it's not real obvious. Maybe you didn't add a site, you're not increasing your enrollment cap, you're not adding grade levels, but you are increasing. You do have more students this year than last year, and you do actually have more SPED students this year than last year, just not real obviously significant. You're going to have the difficult task of deciding what is significant. If it meets at least 10%, which could be a very small number of additional students, then you are going to have to decide, is it worth it for you to change this base? And one way or one thing you might want to consider is what the allocation is. Trying to find that. I think I might have gotten out of the, yeah, I did. So if you remember that allocation worksheet, you will remember that it told us right away that Arizona Autism had about $13,000 that they were going to get. So let's suppose that you changed the numbers a little bit and found that it's only 5,000, or maybe it's only 2,000. Now keep in mind that after a while you're going to get good at this grant application, and if you only have a couple more students, you only have to add 2 or 3 more rows to account for those additional students on that data summary, and you only have to send out 2 or 3 more Dear Administrator letters. So it becomes a lot less work than if you have a lot more students. But you're still going to have to make that determination on your own. The other category, the third scenario, would be if you're actually decreasing. So you don't have more students, in fact you have fewer students, and that is total enrollment, poverty, as well as special education. Now this scenario is sort of in flux because last year, even if you were decreasing, the Department of Education actually allowed you to submit this grant to account for the students that you did have last year, because presumably they were never claimed, right? You did not claim them, and so they were giving you the opportunity to claim them because it was the first time that you were serving them based on when you submitted the Charter School Expansion Act grant. We're not sure if the Department of Education is actually going to allow that this time. The association is working on your behalf to try to have that happen, but there are a number of factors that come into play that make it difficult for the Department of Ed to do that, primarily money and reallocation of dollars at a very late date in the fiscal year. So they're having those discussions, and we're going to find that out. But if you are in that third category, I want you to email me, and what we'll do is we'll run a very, very brief supplemental webinar that explains how it is or what it is that you are to do differently. It's only slightly differently on the grant application that the other two scenarios don't have to have or don't have to do. I did want to make you aware of the little comments here in column F. The comments here indicate, they're basically Connie Hill's notes as to the history of a school and the claiming of the special education students. So for example, with Arizona Autism, you can clearly see that in 2015, all of the students that they received, these 86, this is telling you where they came from. 8 came out of state from California, Texas, Washington, and Nevada. 2 came from Chandler Unified. 4 came from Roosevelt Elementary. So literally the state is tracking where these kids are going and who's claiming them currently. So if you don't claim them, actually, let me just back up a little bit. For these 86 students that that Arizona Autism claimed last year, if they lost some of these students and those students weren't claimed by a charter school by submitting a Charter School Expansion Act grant application, then Arizona Autism continues to claim those students. So that's why you can see how tricky it becomes if schools don't update their numbers by submitting the CSEA grant. Okay, that is, I'm wrapping up the presentation now. I did, before I conclude, I did want to let you know, just a reminder, that the application deadline is June 10th. So you do need to have something submitted by that date. If you do get it submitted and there are errors like any other grant going through ADE, they will let you know potentially what some errors are, similar to an entitlement grant, so that you can fix them, but you do at least want to submit. So as you know, if you've submitted entitlement grants before, you have to get through the validation process, and if you don't, you're going to get error messages. But so long as you get all that fixed and get it submitted by the deadline, then at least you'll have an opportunity to correct any kind of errors. Also want to let you know that there's another training that we are providing on May 11th. It's called the Charter School, pardon me, the Classroom Site Fund. There's a hole in the bucket. And this training focuses on basically talking about Classroom Site Fund, how you can use those monies potentially to alleviate some pressures on your existing budget, all while remaining statutorily compliant. So that's an in-person training at the Arizona Charter Schools Association training room. We'll have more out on that, more information out on that in the next couple weeks, but we hope that you'll join us for that training as well. And lastly, there will be 2 things available for this training. You'll see on my website and the Charter School Association's website the allocation worksheet, as well as a copy of this training, of this PowerPoint training, and the recording. It might take us a day or 2 to get it up there, but we will let you know when it is available. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.